But today's topic is going to be Revelation chapter 10. This class is ongoing, which means that I've been teaching it 3 years. So we start chapter 10 because last time we started at chapter 1. We're going to continue going until Jesus comes. That's what I like to say. So I think we're getting close, that the Middle East is the barometer, is the litmus of what is about to take place. If we're not getting closer now, I don't know when we were getting closer. I'm sure in 1948, when they had their first war, that they felt that way. 1956, the Second War of Israel. 1967, when they had the Six-Day War and they captured Jerusalem, everybody said, this is it. But there was still more time. Obviously, we're here. And then 1973 was a huge war, the Yom Kippur War. And we have not had an actual war again since then, as I write my book, which you can also find from the site. There is, in my definition, a war means, and all the four I just mentioned were in this case, a war means that states attack Israel. In other words, so in my definition, prophetic definition, when they went into Gaza, that was not a war. They called it a war, but Gaza, it was not a state. It's never been a state. Palestinians have never had a state, if you want to look it up. I asked AI one day because I was curious, what's AI going to tell me? No, I said, has there ever been a Palestinian state? And they said, no. And AI told me no, which I already knew. I just wanted to see how much propaganda it was going to give me. So it's not politically correct to say that. But
that Iran attacked
I was gonna go there only because of what's happening in the news. That's not part of this chapter, but yeah, I feel like I need to answer some of that. Yeah, so Ezekiel 38, which I've taught on several times over the years, is the main chapter where you find, actually it's 38 and 39 of Ezekiel. It's one passage, is where you find Iran as a player, but the name is Persia. In fact, I was just listening to the news, trying to keep on top of what's happening over there. And they had an expert on there, went down through the history and said, he said, well, after World War II, it still was Persia. And the last king over there, his title was the Prince of Persia. And it's in 1979, I was still alive, believe it or not. They took over the embassy, and the name has been changed from Iran to Iraq, but still internally they consider themselves to be Persians, and they speak Farsi, which is the Persian language. So but where you find Ezekiel 38 and 39 mentioning the nations, one of the big players is Persia, which is Iran. So we are definitely on the verge of that prophecy potentially being fulfilled. I would never state that this is it because I'm not sure. God knows. I mean, we've had a lot of things happen in the Middle East, and it's been a powder keg, and it's not going to be straightened out until the Antichrist comes. So as I've taught before in chapter 6, the four horsemen, the first horse is the white horse. It's not Jesus, it's the Antichrist. So when the big battle, the next big world war, I'll call it, comes, then the Antichrist is going to be an important part of that. So knowing what I know of Scripture, I look over there now, I would say that this may be, a qualified maybe, some fulfillment of two places you can look at, Psalm 83 and Obadiah. The book of Obadiah is a very short little book, and it's one of the remember they say flyover over the country, the flyover part of the country. Well, Obadiah is usually the flyover part of the prophets. People don't get too much into that book, but it mentions that Israel, whether this is historical, I don't find any historicity to it. But as a fulfillment, it's interesting that it talks about Israel being attacked by a number of nations. And as is usual, the nations are referred to as the ethnos, meaning the ethnic identity of these nations, like Moab and Edom and Syria. Of course, Assyria would have been the name back then, Lebanon. So most of these names are still the same. So it's possible that that prophecy is being fulfilled right now. I would never dogmatically state it, but anytime, as you mentioned, anytime you see Iran, in fact, I've stated that recently when they went into Gaza, I remember saying to the class, I said, when you see Iran get involved, perk up your ears because things are starting to boil, you know. So we in general are not affected by much of that in the United States. This is very much Israel centric. And that's important to understand because all Bible prophecy involves the Jews and Israel. It's because the prophets spoke about Israel, the enemies of Israel in the end times, which we teach and look into. And Israel is the apple of God's eye, not because every Jewish person is wonderful. I grew up in Miami Beach. I can tell you right now, I knew plenty of Jewish people that weren't wonderful. But I had good friends too. So, you know, but I'm just saying people tend to look at the individual person. God's promise is to the nation of Israel, not to a particular Jewish person. So that's God is going to defend Israel, not because the Jews are such great folks today, but because he made a promise. When he makes a promise, that I think the King James says the promises of God are without repentance. In other words, repentance means to change your mind. So when he's promised to watch over them and that he will protect them, he's going to do that. And this class is not dedicated to this, but there's plenty of sources. If you look out on the internet or books, you'll find that there's just one miracle after another through those 4 wars I mentioned, where God did things that were just miraculous. To the point, there's stories of where the Israeli soldiers, somehow they got a hold of, I guess because they captured some of these guys. It's just a few Israelis, you know, and the whole tank brigade just stopped in their tracks. And they said, what happened? Well, these huge guys were there standing in front of you. And of course, they're Muslim. They don't necessarily know what that is. But so, you know, there's just story after story of miraculous occurrences. So God is over Israel. He's protecting Israel for as much for us as for them. Because if he's doing that for his promises for them, what does that portend for us? Right? He's going to do the same for us. We're the chosen generation, the royal priesthood, 1 Peter 2:9. So, any questions on that? I realize this is maybe a good time to ask questions. I'm usually not going to ask them in the middle of my teaching, but okay. Anyway, wholesome thoughts. If you have something, scribble it down. After the class, we'll talk about that. Welcome, sir. I hope you have a seat somewhere here. We got something going on. Okay. Yeah, we're a little overflowed today. Appreciate everyone who's come. So we're going to continue this book from chapter 1 through 22 and over and over again, as long as it takes. So some people will come in, they'll go, you know, most of the book or whatever, and then they probably will go somewhere else. Or they may come in and decide Revelation is not for them. I'm going to tell you right now, the book is understandable, but it takes a lot of study and understanding of the approach to the book. And there are different opinions of the book, and I'm going to teach you, try to emphasize where I've come after 50 years off and on of studying the book. So there are other opinions. I'm not going to name any dates. So if you've come to find out the date of the rapture, I hate to disappoint, but when I get it, I'll let you know. Okay. Anyway, what we have in the book is chapter 1, the vision of the risen Christ. The first time that John saw him, or anybody had an understanding of what he looks like since the resurrection, in his glorified state. Obviously, you know, Mary and the others saw him in the post-resurrection period. But that's not what he looks like now. What they saw is not what he looks like now. If we want to say to ourselves, what does Jesus look like now? You have to read Revelation chapter 1. That's the only place you're going to find out. And when you see that Jesus, I think even John, who knew him so intimately, was very surprised what he saw, and he tried to describe it. and we went over that. Chapter 2 and 3 are 7 churches that letters were sent to, and they are edificational for us, but they also give us understanding about what God considers to be a pro and con, if you will. And then 4 and 5, we see the timeless scene in heaven before the revelation starts. Chapter 6, we went through the seals, and then in chapter 7, it was a parenthetical, and we saw a more focused view of the beginning and middle of the tribulation. And in chapter 8, we went through the trumpets, in chapter 9, and so 8 and 9 are the trumpets, and we talked about the seals and the trumpets. And now we have another parenthetical. So to explain it, a parenthetical in the book is where God kind of takes us out of the current thought, just like we would write, I was going to Mississippi, and then in a parenthetical it says, my truck broke down or something, you go into a whole, a side issue. So that's what God does. And so the way he did the book is in time, parenthetical, back to time in the parenthetical chapter. Chapter 10 is parenthetical, and it's a very important chapter, but it's not I guess it's not one of the ones that people usually get excited about. But we're going to go through it and talk about what it is. There really is a great lesson to it, though. When we get there, we'll see. So chapter 10, we see, by the way, this picture right here, and most of the ones I'm going to be using from now on, I've created with AI. So I went into, I can't probably Bing, whichever one, I think it was Bing I was using. But there's, everybody's got AI. AI is the new thing. I like to call it I. So did you go and find out what I has to say? Because it's kind of like its own ego, isn't it? So play on words, AI. But anyway, so what we see is that this picture was generated by one sentence. I just said I want to see an angel with a scroll, rainbow around him, and I don't think I asked for wings, but they always come with wings. It's like a burger and fries. People say, what does an angel look like? Oh, he's got wings. Sometimes he's got a halo or whatever. How many people here have seen an angel? Anybody?
My wife.
No.
Oh, man, that's some points, brother. Man, why didn't I say that? Man, I'm gonna use that. That's good. Hi, Angel. All right, good. So, but at any rate, so it was like one sentence. It's pretty amazing that you can just have a one sentence and it'll make a picture for you. And it's just in its baby steps. Who knows where it's going? This thing is going so fast that the people who are making it can't really understand how fast it's going. And I cover some of that on my website, new website, with what I call prophetic news. But the pace is amazing. So in chapter 10, verse 1, and then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. In some ways, it looks like the description of Christ in chapter 1. However, in the book of Revelation, Christ is never referred to as an angel. In fact, in the New Testament, Christ is not referred to. There are what we call Christophanies, appearances of Christ in the Old Testament, where he is referred to as the angel of the Lord, but never in the New Testament. But just to clarify, when you see Jesus in chapter 1, if you compare the two, you'll see that it's clearly not Jesus. It's most likely an archangel, and arch just means highest. So the highest angel, either Michael or Gabriel, but the name's not given to us. He had a little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. Typically, in Bible terminology, not to take away from this, but many interpreters have said the sea represents the Gentile powers or nations. And the land, this is true. The land is usually referred to as Israel. Israel is the land. Obviously, the land to us is 7 continents, right? But in a biblical framework, it's the land is Israel, and all through the Old Testament, it's referred to as the land. This scroll is not, talking about the angel has a little scroll. It says, and it says little scroll in the original and in the translation. The scroll is not the large seven sealed scroll, which has been fully opened by chapter 10. This small scroll's contents are a mystery, and the seven seals are not. So we see in chapters 4 and 5 that Christ is given who is worthy. First, I should say, it's a big who is worthy. We're looking for somebody who can take the scroll. The scroll represents the entire judgments of the tribulation. So this is a little scroll. Christ was given a larger scroll and a seven sealed scroll. This is not a sealed scroll, and it's open, and it's a little scroll. So it's kind of a mystery because it says it's a mystery. So as we go through it, we're hopefully not going to add to or take away. Verse 3, and called out with a loud voice. That's the angel, like a roaring lion. Well, Christ is oftentimes referred to as a lion of the tribe of Judah, so you could think that's Jesus, but you have to look at the overall description. The overall description is not Jesus. And when he called out, the seven thunders sounded. Can anybody think of a situation where in the life and ministry of Jesus that it sounded like there was thunder and people misinterpreted it? The baptism of Jesus, yeah. So, God spoke, and some heard that it was God, but others said it sounded like thunder. And probably I think that may have been the case at the cross also. So, some people can understand thunder and some can't. So what's the differentiation? Why would some understand thunder as God and others think it's a natural phenomenon? The only thing I can come up with is that the Holy Spirit, who is in or upon people, gives them the understanding of what's being said. And the people who are not spiritual people, it just sounds like thunder. Verse 4, and when the seven thunders had sounded, I was about to write, okay, John is in a cave, just to repaint this. This whole thing is John in a cave, from what we understand, on a prison island of Patmos, which is just a lot of rocks, nothing good going on there. That's why the Romans put their political prisoners and other prisoners there. It's the Alcatraz of the day. He probably is barely getting enough to eat, and he's in a very, very horrible situation. But he's given all these visions, or it's one big vision comprised of another number of small visions, right? Most of the chapters are that way, but the chapters weren't in the original. So he's writing this very, very long letter, which is going to be sent out. And so when he was about to write, because picture him, he's the angel's there, he's seeing and hearing all this, and he's trying to write it down. And he heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down. So do not write it down is a directive that stands out in the Old Testament from one particular place that I remember, and that is Daniel, the final chapter 12. Does anybody remember that? Daniel is given to understand a number of things, and he's told that he should seal it up. So it's very unusual because when prophets have in the past have been given the visions, the understanding, the words, whatever you want to call them, they're told to propagate them, right? Generally, you want people to know about it. You write them down, you circulate them. But in this particular situation, Daniel was told, and now John was told, to write, not write as he's writing, not to write these particular things down, which is very, very unusual. So why would that be? Do you think that John understood these things? That's a matter of interpretation. In other words, did he understand what the thunders were saying and he didn't write them down, or he didn't understand them? So I think he must have understood them. Otherwise, how could he not write them down? if he didn't get what was being said, there would be no reason to say, don't write them down. He had to know what these things were, but they were not to be part of the letter. The meaning was not to be part of the letter that was circulated. Keep in mind that this letter was actually a scroll, and that was being written. Everything was written down as a scroll in those days. They didn't have books like we have. Later, they had codexes, which are single sheets that are stacked together, which ultimately became books. But in this New Testament and in the Old Testament, things were written on scrolls. You remember Jesus went into the temple. He was given to read Isaiah, and he was handed the scroll. Everything was a scroll. So I think sometimes we try to impose our modern ideas on the culture and times, and they don't really translate well. And swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it. A lot of in it there going on. That there would be no more delay. That's the big important part. So is there a delay from God's standpoint? God's in the eternity. He's in the timeless dimension. Is he going to delay up in heaven? Well, since there's no time, there wouldn't be delay for God. He lives in all dimensions and all times at the same time. We can't even understand it, but it's true. So, but delay from the earthly standpoint. In other words, these judgments that are coming on the earth are in time, because people are in time. The nations are in time. But in the terms of God's understanding for the earth and for the tribulation, this is saying that that it's time now to wrap things up. That's probably what we'd say today. And the angel testifies that the final judgments and the return of Christ at Armageddon, the Greek word is parousia, are imminent. Parousia is usually means in the Greek that everybody will see him. So parousia is we have the English word peruse, and I remember my mother used to, when I was little, go to the department stores, and they'd come up and say, "What are you doing?" to her. You want help? You want something? And she said, "No, I'm just perusing." It's the same word. So, but the parousia is a definite Greek word, which means Jesus is going to be seen by everybody, seen all around. So there's going to be another coming for the church, which is not seen, and that's a different Greek word. And I've taught on that before. This is the seventh trumpet. So through chapters 8 and 9, there were 6 trumpets going. And now we're coming to the final or 7th trumpet. So there's 7 seals. I believe the 7 trumpets are a different viewpoint of those 7 seals. And then you have the 7 bowls, which, as I've taught, I believe are the final volley, if you will, of the final war, softening up the enemy as the military would do. So in verse 7, but that in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the 7th angel, okay? The 7th trumpet here is not the trumpet of the rapture, not to be confused. This is a series of 7. You can't just take it out of there and say, "Oh, I'm going to interpret this as the trumpet of the rapture." This is a series of 6 before in chapter 8 and 9, and then the 7th trumpet. And in the 7th trumpet ultimately is going to be seen in chapter 11, 15. So God has a definite timeline in this book, and we're studying that timeline. I like to call it the A, B, and C's. And this final trumpet's at the end, point C. The rapture is point A, and B is the midpoint. Pretty much all Bible scholars believe there is a beginning, a mid, and the end. So in the final trumpet here of chapter 11, verse 15, which we'll get to next week, when the Christ will have the world dominion, and that means the first 6 bowls must be before the last trumpet, right? So since the last trumpet is the culmination of everything, the bowls come before that. So in my understanding, the 7 seals are all there is. The trumpets are a different viewpoint of those, oftentimes the effect of the judgments. And then the seven bowls are the very last things that happen in rapid succession, much like the judgments of Moses in the Exodus, which also happened very quickly. Then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, "Go take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and land." Okay, so that's pretty interesting because why didn't he just take it up front? You know, give me the scroll, I'll read it for myself. But you know, John is very obedient. He's probably in his 90s at this point, definitely 80s. He is the beloved, and he's received already so much that he's just overwhelmed. So I don't think John would not take it upon himself to do anything at this point. He's totally in submission to Christ and the angel from Christ. So, you know, he is not going to go and take the scroll out of the angel's hand until he's told it's permissible. You know, I wish we could meet John and talk to him. That would be amazing. Because he went from a teenager and watched Christ's life. He was at the cross, he was at the tomb, and then he watched all of his fellow apostles become great men of God and spread the word throughout the world. And as only as he became older did he come into prominence in the community, and he became the last living witness of Christ as far as the community of faith, you know. So he was probably the most amazing person. And as I said before, at the end of the Gospel of John, there's this discussion between Christ, he's on earth, and Peter and John. And Peter, as usual, you know, has to jump in on it. And he said, okay, Lord, you just told me I'm going to be led to where I don't want to go. I'm sure he didn't care for that message. And then, you know, in his usual Peterific, I don't know what word, Petrus, I don't know, in his usual form, he said, "Hey, what about this guy?" You know, he always kind of jumped out ahead of everybody, and oftentimes he made blunders, but he was a leader. He was a very dominant person. And so, and Christ said to Peter about John, he said, "If I will that this guy remain till I come, what's that to you?" And then it says the word went about that John would ever die. And then it says right in the gospel that was not true, you know. But John did live to see the coming of Christ. So I don't believe that. Well, we're reading it right now. This is it. He saw, and he says in the very beginning, "I am the witness. I saw, you know, I wrote it down. All that has happened, and I saw it all." So what did he see? He saw the second coming of Christ, totally from the beginning to the end of all the events. So was Christ making an offhand comment? Of course, he never did. Everything he said had great meaning. And when he predicted what would happen to John, it was spot on. It was 60 years later, he came and gave the revelation to John, fulfilling his prophetic statement. We usually don't think about that, but that was a prophecy. That was a prophecy. John will remain till I come, but it didn't mean physically come back. So that's what you know, the early church, they didn't have our perspective. So they were thinking, "Oh, John's never going to die, you know. He gets to be the great guy, the favored boy, you know, he's the wonder child, and the rest of us are second-class apostles, you know." But no, that wasn't true. For whatever reason, Jesus decided to come back and give this message to him, and he faithfully wrote it down. So when we say, you know, that the angel gave John the scroll, and he wrote down certain things and certain things he didn't, he was totally obedient. This is the most important and poignant, I think, part of chapter 10, of this little vision. And keep in mind that chapter 10 is, the guys who wrote the chapters got this one right. It is one complete thought or vision. So the whole vision of Revelation is divided into little visions, if you will, you know. We call this pericopes in theological talk. But so I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll, and he said to me, "Take and eat it." This is the important part. And I thought about this morning when I was watching the news about the Middle East. "And it will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey." So why would it have two diametrically opposed effects on John? Because you got to go back and remember the Gospels. I did make a reference where John and his brother wanted to call down fire upon some folks that weren't aligning with their theological position. Jesus, let's rain down fire on these guys, you know? So that's how he started out. And then it said at the very end, John was an old man. He couldn't walk or talk, hardly talk or anything. And they carried him around on a stretcher, I guess we'd say today. All he ever said was, love one another. So the man who was the guy to call down fire and destroy his enemies at the end was the apostle of love. Very interesting transition. But this is the point, I believe, that in other words, even then in his physical understanding and as much as the Spirit could give him to see these things, he still, I don't know, and I don't know that we know as much as to understand the fact that these judgments will be horrible and bitter. In other words, you know, it's like, get those heathen dogs, Lord, you know, but that's one attitude. But the other attitude is, you know, that would be your sweetness. Get them, Lord. Let's go duke them out, you know. And then the other part of it is that it's going to be bitter because what's going to come upon the earth is the worst time in history. We can't even imagine it. You can go back and say, well, what time was worse? World War II? No. World War II is a walk in the park compared to what's coming. You know, first of all, 2 billion people die right off the bat. And so it says 1/4. There's 8 billion in the world. Do some first grade math and you come up with 2 billion. So that's how I got that. But the thing is that all these judgments, and I know sometimes I joke maybe too much, but the truth is that this is a very serious book. And just like what's going on in the Middle East now, you know, I guess there's one side of me that wants to say, yeah, Israel, go nuke them. Go get rid of Iran, those heathen dogs, you know. And then I realized, well, there's a lot of Christians there. There's a big Christian movement in Iran. And there's a lot of Christians all over the Middle East. And there's a lot of people need to be saved there. So I got to rein it in, you know, it's bitter and sweet. It's sweet and bitter, even if it does evolve to where it might go. Because like these judgments, there's some horrible situations. People are going to be, that don't take the mark are going to be living out in the desert, the sun's scorching them, nothing to drink, nothing to eat. You know, who knows how long they can put up with that. But the tribulation is horrible. And so the people who think they're going through the tribulation need to rethink it and look at the book again. I personally don't see that God is going to drag his bride through the mud and the sludge before he comes for her. The tribulation is definitely the mud and the sludge. It's horrible. But that's my 2 cents. So, you know, this John, like I mentioned, is from Luke 9:54 through 55. Is the same John that wanted to bring fire on them. And in verse 11, and I was told you must prophesy again about many peoples and nations, languages, and kings. So after he got this encapsulated parenthetical view of the world, the earth and heaven, he's seeing heaven and what's going to be happening on the earth, you know, he still wasn't finished. And so God, I think it's about the halfway point, you know. When I was young, they had really long movies and they'd have something called what are they called again?
Intermission.
Intermission. Thank you. Yeah, I know nobody knows what that is anymore. But yeah, usually the movies were so long. Of course, most people didn't have TV or there wasn't much on it. So when you went to the movies, that was a big deal. And, you know, the thing would be 2 hours long and then you have an intermission, go to the bathroom, get something to eat, come back for another 2 hours. It was a big deal, you know. Today, people don't have that kind of time span. But this is halfway through the book. It's 22 chapters. Chapter 11 is, you know, there weren't chapters originally, but it's about halfway through the book. So next week, we're going to go to chapter 11, and it's from 11 through 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Actually, from 11 to the end of the book, it's just power packed. I'm not going to be able to go as fast as I did to this chapter because every verse is just packed full of information and explanations need to be made about why it is and where it is and what is it actually saying. So there is a framework. Just if you don't remember anything else, remember the book of Revelation is A, B, and C. The beginning A, the middle B, and the end C. So it's 7 years, and there are definite differences between the first 3.5 and the last 3.5, which is called the Great Tribulation. And as we go, we're going to be I don't think it's pinning the tail on the donkey. Maybe that's it's a game we played when we were kids. But anyway, it's kind of like that. We're taking verses and sections and going, where does it fit on this timeline? And there are places that each one fits. In other words, there is a scheme to this. It's not haphazard. It's not all symbolism without any meaning. Most of it explains itself in the passage or directly near it or in the Old Testament. In other words, if you dig, all of it is understandable. And that's what I want you to be left with. And if you could pray for Israel and God's will to be done there in this time of their trouble. But it's nothing like the time of trouble that's going to come called Jacob's trouble, the 7 years that we're going to study.